This is 2014, 5 years ago. Russia is hosting the Winter Olympics in Sochi on the Black Sea. The eyes of the world are upon Russia and specifically upon Vladimir Putin. Putin is in his glory. Before the games were over, though, Russia, and Putin in particular, got very embarrassed when a huge pro-democracy uprising took over the streets of the capital city of Ukraine. Russia had taken care in Ukraine to prop up a pro-Putin strongman as the leader of that country. He, by the way, employed Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's soon-to-be campaign chairman, as his top political advisor in Ukraine. But in 2014, in the face of mass protests by Ukrainians demanding that their country be a Western-facing country, that it integrate with Europe, that it no longer be controlled as a corrupt outpost of Russia and the Kremlin, that pro-Putin Ukrainian leader, Viktor Yanukovych, initially responded by killing lots of civilian protesters. And wow, that looked just terrible alongside all the Olympics coverage, didn't it? Ultimately, though, he ended up fleeing. He fled first to eastern Ukraine, and then he ultimately fled to Moscow. The protesters had won. Ukraine would turn west and start to disentangle itself from the Kremlin. But of course, Putin was not having it. And ultimately, in 2014, Putin would choose to address this problem, this embarrassing problem in Ukraine, with military action, including just invading and seizing a big portion of Ukraine, Crimea. For Europe, it was the first use of military force by one country to move borders and take a piece of another country since World War II. In addition to seizing Crimea and making it part of Russia, Russian forces also dug in for a long, grinding war and occupation in other parts of Ukraine. And while Russia plainly thought this was its right and Ukraine was its to take if it wanted to, that's not how the world is supposed to work anymore. And this is a big deal. It's a big departure from the way that countries are supposed to interact, particularly countries that are in Europe or on Europe's borders. And so the international reaction was swift and unsubtle, and very serious. And a whole bunch of things happened to Russia in response to that behavior by them. And because they are still keeping Crimea and because they are still occupying and waging war inside other parts of Ukraine, these repercussions for Russia haven't ended. It's been a long 5 years. But right now, we are starting to get a very clear picture in the U.S. about our own government that you can see very clearly when you look at the sort of menu of the main things that were done to Russia, the things that were supposed to happen to Russia, basically as punishment for that behavior. Russia, of course, was subject to very serious sanctions, not just U.S. sanctions, but international binding sanctions. Hit the oligarchs, people close to Putin, key Russian economic sectors, serious and damaging sanctions. That was one part of it, one pillar. Also, the G8 became the G7. Russia and Putin were kicked out of that group of the world's most influential countries. That was one part of it. Also, the United States started directly providing lots of aid, lots of assistance to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to stand up against Russia. And in addition to that, a fourth pillar of the response to what Russia did to Ukraine, in lots of different countries in Europe, the U.S. set up something called the European Deterrence Initiative. When President Obama announced it in 2014, it was called the European Reassurance Initiative, then changed its name to the European Deterrence Initiative ultimately, but the basic idea was the same. Quote, to reassure allies of our solemn commitment to their security and territorial integrity as a, quote, necessary and appropriate show of support to our allies who are now deeply concerned by Russia's occupation and attempted annexation of Crimea and other provocative actions in Ukraine. The United States stands by its allies as they have stood by us. That's how the Obama administration announced that new European Reassurance or European Deterrence Initiative. So those are really four big things the U.S. did with the international community to punish Russia for their bad behavior, to push back against Russia, to stop them from doing more of this kind of thing, to pressure them to reverse their actions. Sanctions, kicking them out of the G8, aid to Ukraine, and this European initiative, right? Well, what happened to all four of those things? With sanctions, We know that that was the main point and the bottom line of all the known myriad connections between the Trump campaign and various people associated with the Russian government during the 2016 presidential election. At the time, the Russian government was intervening in the U.S. election to try to help Trump win. All these various emissaries from the Russian government were imploring various people associated with the Trump campaign that the sanctions all needed to go. It all sort of looks like, when you look back at the 2016 campaign, that might have just been a Russian operation targeting the sanctions, because that was what they went to the Trump campaign on over and over and over again in all of those myriad connections. Sanctions. We've also seen the Trump administration try to unilaterally lift Russian sanctions since they've been in power. We've seen Trump slow walk other Russian sanctions whenever he can, even though Congress at times has resisted him on that. So that's the first pillar, sanctions, trouble, right? Well, then there's the second pillar, Russia being kicked out of the G8. Last week at what is now the G7 summit, we saw President Trump repeatedly arguing that Russia ought to be let back in. It should go back to being the G8. He might invite Putin to do that himself. So that's the first two pillars, sanctions, G8 becoming the G7, Well, the third one, aid to Ukraine. Last week, Politico had the scoop on that third pillar of the response to what Russia did, which is America's aid to Ukraine. Politico's scoop, quote, Trump holds up Ukraine military aid meant to confront Russia. Quote, U.S. military aid to Ukraine is seen as a litmus test for how strongly the American government is pushing back against Moscow. Scaling back that assistance could expose Trump to allegations that his policies are favoring Moscow. Oh, it could. Trump asked his national security team to review the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. The funds for Ukraine can't be spent while they're under review. The money will expire on September 30th if it is not spent by then. So if that Ukraine assistance isn't spent by the end of this month, it goes away. And as long as it's under review, it can't be spent. So that means Ukraine is apparently no longer going to get aid from the United States government. And that's the third thing that happened, right? Well, now there's this fourth point, the European Reassurance Initiative, the European Deterrence Initiative. It's the last one of those four pillars. Trump's kicking that one out as well. There's been a lot of controversy and criticism this week over the Trump administration announcing that it turns out Mexico won't pay for President Trump's wall. Instead, they're going to raid U.S. military funds to pay for it. That's led to headlines like these all around the country as cities and states all over the U.S. learn about what's being taken away from U.S. military facilities and U.S. troops to instead build Trump's wall. Hey, what about Mexico? But aside from what they're taking away in the United States, they are also taking away money from a very specific list of overseas projects. You might have seen the teeny tiny little print on the spreadsheet that they put out listing all the stuff they're cutting in order to fund Trump's wall with that money instead. This is a White House decision about what money they're going to take from the military, what they're going to defund in the U.S. military so Trump can have his wall instead. And it's a whole bunch of different items in a whole bunch of different countries, all with technical language and military acronyms and stuff. But if you look closely, if you get out your magnifying glass, there is a distinct trend here. You see this? See that first initial ERI, ERI, EDI, 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 EDI? A lot of the items on the spreadsheet about stuff they're cutting overseas start with this acronym, either EDI or ERI. Well, EDI, European Deterrence Initiative. ERI, what it used to be called, European Reassurance Initiative. At least 25 of the overseas military projects that Trump is summarily defunding by executive action are specifically these projects that were designed by the Obama administration and have been implemented since to form a bulwark against Russia, to specifically help our NATO allies be reassured that we've got their back and that we will help them develop their capacity to stand up against Russia, given what Russia has been doing with its bad behavior in their neighborhood, including invading other countries and taking parts of them for itself. And this stuff is not like, building baseball fields or painting scary faces on the front of fighter planes, however important those things are. I mean, this is the stuff that the military brags about as its serious deterrent mission abroad. I mean, here's the Air Force Times from earlier this year. Airmen will continue stepping up to deter Russia in Europe. This is the Air Force Times talking about what's being funded by the European Deterrence Initiative this year. The funding will go to airbase improvements in Eastern Europe, including a munitions storage facility at Malacky Air Base in Slovakia, and a taxiway at the U.S. base in Norway. Well, both of those items are on this list of things that are now being cut by President Trump. I mean, here's the Air Force Chief of Staff bragging in light of the European Deterrence Initiative funding. Quote, Russia's aggression is not simply a matter for Ukraine. It's a threat to the region, to Europe, to the United States, and to the stability of the international order. But don't worry, with this European Deterrence Initiative, we've got your back. NATO allies in Europe. That was earlier this year, except now Trump just announced he's cutting all of those things. Here's the U.S. Naval Institute, sort of aghast today at what exactly is being defunded to fund Trump's wall instead. In Spain, for example, $21.6 million for port operations facilities as part of the Pentagon's European Deterrence Initiative. That is being deferred. That base is home to 4 U.S. missile destroyers. Another $66 million in funds for P-8A Poseidon airfield upgrades at a U.S. naval air station in Italy. That's being cut to pay for the wall, too. And again, this is serious stuff. This is, special operations forces, special operations training facilities and operations facilities in Estonia, ammunition storage in Poland, airfield upgrades in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania. So it's been interesting to watch this, particularly in local newspapers all around the country, right? There's lots of people all over the country who are starting to get mad about what the president is taking money from to pay for his wall. And I mean, it does include some incredible stuff like daycare centers and elementary schools for the kids of U.S. service members. They're literally defunding the daycare center at Andrews Air Base, which is the home of Air Force One. Enjoy your flight, Mr. President. But these overseas cuts, the overseas ones, they have a very specific message to Russia. That everything, all 4 of these pillars that the United States set up as its response to Russia, for what Russia did over the last 5 years, to respond to them invading and seizing a part of another country. All of that. I mean, the sanctions, kicked out of the G8, military aid to the country they invaded, and now our assistance to our NATO allies to help them build up their capacity to deter what Russia is doing. All of that, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of it piece by piece, dismantled by the Trump administration. Yeah, but don't worry. Russia's clearly back in the box, really cowed and worried about any further bad behavior and what might happen to them internationally. Just as soon as they get done with this new round of exploding experimental nuclear weapons and shoving all the radioactive flotsam up on nearby beaches, since they're pretty sure nobody will care about it if they do it. As soon as they're done with that kind of thing, they'll get back to being the good, responsible international citizen that deserves everything they're getting from President Trump, and I'm sure more. I'm sure there's lots more.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.